All right, so to continue the theme today around how things are financed in our system, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Melanie Joe. Melanie D. Joe was born and raised in Southern California. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Southern California and a Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the USC School of Pharmacy. Melanie completed an ASHP accredited general practice residency in pharmacy practice at Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena, California, and furthered her leadership training with successful completion of the ASHP Pharmacy Leadership Academy. Most recently, she received a master's in public administration with an emphasis in health management in 2017. Melanie's pharmacy career spans over 20 years. She served as a clinical pharmacist in pediatrics and has held hospital pharmacy leadership roles since 2004. Previous to her current position as Chief Pharmacy Officer of UCI Health, Melanie was the Director of Pharmacy of the Keck Hospital of USC and USC Norris Cancer Hospital for 7 years. Melanie joined UC Irvine Medical Center in 2014 and spearheaded the growth and development of the pharmacy enterprise, including launching 2 infusion pharmacies and a multi-million-dollar retail specialty pharmacy, and expanding the 340B program. Education has been a passion for Melanie throughout her career. She developed clinical rotations in pediatrics at her practice sites, created an ASHP accredited general practice pharmacy residency, and held multiple faculty positions as adjunct assistant professor of pharmacy practice. She coordinated and taught the IPPE course for hospital systems pharmacy practice at USC School of Pharmacy. She was instrumental in developing the proposal for the UC Irvine School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, their attainment of ACPE accreditation, and was appointed Associate Director and Founding Associate Dean for Pharmacy Professional Affairs in 2020. She currently serves on the Clinical Faculty Search Committee and Dean's Leadership Cabinet. Welcome, Dr. Melanie Joe.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for accommodating my last-minute request to change the timing of this presentation. I do really appreciate it. Very interesting. I caught the tail end of Scott Thompson's presentation, and that's a really, really valuable one. I can't say enough about the value of that, and this kind of goes along with that in terms of taking a look at and really focusing on value rather than just pay fee for services. We're looking at value, and in this case, outcomes-based contracts, and whether or not they will actually address our concerns with the increasing cost of drugs. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, there we go. So today's objectives are first to review the structure of the pharmaceutical sector in the United States. We'll take a look at some of the problems that we have here with drug prices and increased expenses. Look at the outcomes-based pharmaceutical contracts and how they are applied. Assess our outcomes-based contracts in terms of how they can improve the value or decrease the spending in the United States. And then finally wrap up by just taking a quick look at some of the current drug pricing policy proposals to address the high cost of drugs in the United States. So historically, we'll take a look and see that our healthcare expenses, as we all know, have been increasing. In 2016, over $3.3 trillion were spent in the United States on healthcare. That comprised close to 18% of our gross domestic product. And of that, prescription drugs comprise about 10%, or about $329 billion. Historically, we have seen that prescription drug costs have outpaced increases in hospital and physician expenditures. And although I think we've seen that percentage come down through the years, at present, they still comprise a greater percentage of those hospital and physician expenses. And so that's why many of our policymakers, providers, pharmacy benefit managers, and insurers are really taking a look at options to slow the prescription drug spending increases. In addition to that, I think we've all heard about the high cost of drugs in some of the media. And as we know, the public or our patients actually pay a greater percentage of their prescription drug costs out of pocket. And therefore, it is a big public health or consumer concern. If we look at the graph on the left side, it's clearly obvious, as I mentioned, that healthcare spending has just gone up through the years. In 1970, the U.S. spent about $75 billion in healthcare expenditures. By the year 2000, that number went all the way up to 1.4 trillion. And in 2018, the amount spent had more than doubled, up to $3.6 trillion. So total healthcare expenditures are on the rise. And if we look at the pie chart on the right side, these are 2018 figures. The light green area is our prescription drug costs, which comprise about 9% of total healthcare spending. Oftentimes, we also take a look at this, as mentioned, based on the gross domestic product, and that number also, or that percentage, has gone up through the years. So we talked about those 1970 numbers, total costs at about 75 billion. At that time, our our healthcare spending comprised about 7%. But as I mentioned, in 2018, that percentage went all the way up to 17.7%. So clearly, healthcare expenses have been going up through the years, and so this is a true concern for the government and for all of us as consumers as well. This is a very simple graph, and it really basically just shows you that our expenses on retail prescriptions have been also, simultaneously, obviously, been going up through the years, with over $325 billion being spent in 2016. And one thing I want to point out here is oftentimes when we hear in the news about the high cost of drugs and retail drug expenses, know that they are only talking about the expenses truly in the retail pharmacy sector. This does not include any of the drug expenses that are used in hospitals or when physicians administer drugs in their practice sites. So only the retail drug spend is what is really, I guess, the public concern. This very complicated diagram basically demonstrates our pharmacy supply chain. If we look at the red arrows, those arrows are actually where we have contracts between parties. The dark blue is where the drug really shows you the drug pathway. So clearly, we can see drugs start down here at the manufacturer. They go to what we call a wholesaler or a distributor, who then ships those drugs to pharmacies, who then dispenses to consumers here. The gray arrows demonstrate the exchange of money, and I think that that is really for us and for the purposes of this discussion, really where we are very, very concerned. You can see how complex this sort of supply chain system is, taking a look here at the drug manufacturers actually providing rebates back to our pharmacy benefits managers, who also provide a share of those same rebates back to the payers. And this is really important as we take a look at our outcomes-based pharmacy contracts. Two areas that I want you to pay attention to here that oftentimes go very much unnoticed is the pharmacy benefits manager and the distributors. Often we don't even think about them when we think about revenue. In the news, it's commonly focused on are the revenues reaped by our drug manufacturers. However, it should not go unnoticed that these PBMs and the distributors make a lot of revenue or generate a lot of revenue from this industry as well. The other point I think that's interesting to note is there are very, very few pharmacy benefits managers as well as distributors that actually comprise the bulk of all of these transactions in the United States. Really, there are the top 3 PBMs in the country. Those are Express Scripts, CVS Caremark, or Optum Rx, and they actually process 70 to 75% of retail prescription claims. While on this side, the distributor side, there are really only 3 big wholesalers that pretty much all of the hospitals and pharmacies use throughout the country, physicians' offices, and those are McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal. They generate 85 to 90% of the U.S. drug distribution revenues, and that's really important to note. So, what are some of the reasons for these increased pharmaceutical expenses? namely increased number of prescription and increased drug pricing. And I will go into some of these various characteristics on a few of these future slides. So let me get to more detail here. As we can see from a utilization perspective, we've seen an increased number of prescriptions being generated through the years. In 1992, around 1.9 billion prescriptions were written. However, in 2009, that number increased to 3.9 billion. This is largely due to our aging baby boomer population, so more elderly, but also due to introduction of a lot of new drugs. And a lot of our older drugs have also gotten some new indications. So there are these drugs actually, we can treat, I guess, more disease states with these new drugs and increased indications. In addition, there have been technology enhancements which allow us to identify disease states. Many of these disease states obviously are treated by drug therapy. So therefore, obviously, we have some increased prescription writing. There's also has been improved access over the years, increased insurance coverage, and low copays for our patients. The implementation of Medicare Part D, which is the drug benefit in 2006, increased the elderly's access to prescription drugs as well. As far as prices, the drug prices have certainly gone up, and they were going up much more steadily in the 80s with double-digit increases. The pace of drug price increases has slowed a bit now in the 90s to 4.5%, and I would say nowadays in the 2020 era, we're seeing increases of around in the 3 to 4% range, and those are generally for inflation. However, the area that is still seeing some really high increases are in our specialty drug realm. The specialty drugs are actually often covered by Medicare Part B, or it's considered the medical benefit versus the drug benefit. The other, I think, piece that really pushes this is there have been a lot of generic drug manufacturers that have either closed down or consolidated, creating these generic drug monopolies. And this has also resulted in extraordinary pricing. Some of the examples of that are that we've heard of in the news are like the EpiPen or insulin. And we'll talk about those again. Those will come back again in this discussion. Increased drug prices, as I mentioned, are often due to market exclusives, the consolidation that I mentioned. There's also been a lot of anti-competitive behaviors. And as an example, a lot of the manufacturers, towards the end of the patent life of a drug, will actually seek increased indications, so new indications for a drug that's nearing the end of its patent life. And they do this so that that patent life is extended. The other piece is they will create new dosage formulations, such as we've heard of the injectable depot or long-acting formulations. And those formulations will also give a greater number of years, an increased number of years to the patent, and thereby they can keep those drug prices very, very high. The other thing that I wanted to bring up in today's discussion, and often people don't realize this, and certainly the layperson does not realize this, is the true lack of transparency when it comes to actual drug prices. And I mention this because, to be honest with you, all of the nomenclature is actually rather confusing. You'll often hear of something called AWP, or average wholesale price, versus the actual acquisition cost. And we use AWP in the retail setting, and that's really what we get reimbursed off of, but that may or may not be reflective of the acquisition cost. I'm sure you've heard of 340B as well, which is the lowest drug price that you could obtain a drug, versus wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, and that's really the highest drug pricing that you can purchase at. There's also a lot of rebates, and so what often happens is a pharmacy may have a contract with a manufacturer, and if they achieve a certain tier of purchases, so a certain volume of purchases, then that pharmacy would receive a rebate on the back end. So, you know, when we are trying to find out or determine, gosh, what are the actual drug costs? It's actually a rather complex question because what are we talking about? Which contract are we talking about? I can say here at UCI, we have basically 3 contract prices for every one of our pharmacies. So we do have our GPO price, which is our contract price. We have the wholesale acquisition cost, or WAC, and we also use 340B as we are a disproportionate share hospital. So we are able to get a certain percentage of drugs on that 340B contract. So, you know, determining what is the cost of something, it's like I say, it's not very obvious, and there's a real lack of transparency. There's also not a lot of sharing, because a lot of those contracts that you would obtain with a manufacturer, you're not allowed realistically to share the details of that contract with others. And therefore, you know, I wouldn't know as the Chief Pharmacy Officer of UCI, I realistically don't know what the pricing is, just say at Cedars-Sinai or at St. Joe's. And that's something that, you know, in general, we are not allowed to discuss with others. So there's not a lot of transparency when it comes to pricing. As I mentioned, there's been a number of new
Dr. Joe,
innovative
we do have a
drugs
question before you keep
market.
moving on. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
hello?
Yeah, I just
Yes?
wanted to add, we do have a question before you keep moving.
Oh, sure.
Can you explain what exactly 340B is?
Oh, sure. Okay. So 340B is basically, it's a government program that is offered to certain covered entities. And in our case, we qualify at UCI because we have a large percentage of indigent patients. And so that allows us access to this basically 340B program, where the government mandates to manufacturers that they must sell a certain percentage of their drugs at a lower cost. And really, this program came about just historically, because you might say, well, why would they do that, right? So this came about because a lot of the, especially for these innovative new drugs, and I'm referring to now on this slide, the drug prices, the acquisition cost exceeded the amount that you would be reimbursed by your third-party payer. So therefore, no one would be incentivized, obviously, to provide those medications to patients. So the government basically stepped in, created the 340B program, which allows certain prescriptions that are retail prescriptions, and most of these specialty drugs are on the retail side of things or the ambulatory side. So a patient would go to a clinic to obtain them. They generally don't obtain them in a hospital setting. And so, yeah, that's where that 340B program came about. And it is, like I say, it is the lowest cost at which you can actually purchase a drug. But not everybody and not every entity is able to use that contract. You have to qualify. Does that make sense?
Thanks for that clarification.
Pardon me?
So thanks for the clarification there.
Okay, great. And yeah, feel free to stop me. I'm sorry, I just not seeing your screen, so I don't know what's going on. But anyhow, so as I mentioned, the new drugs, these new drugs are often curative or highly preventative. They are known to reduce morbidity, mortality, decrease overall treatment costs, and oftentimes have fewer side effects than their older generation predecessors. These are often known as lifestyle drugs, and but these are they tend to be very, very expensive. This drug class as a whole is, you know, the percentage of dollars that is spent on specialty drugs is expected to increase through the years, as I mentioned on the slide, from 17% all the way to 42% in 2021. And oftentimes these drugs are billed on Medicare Part B. So it's the medical benefit rather than the pharmaceutical benefit, where we see these expenses actually lie. A great example of this that most of us are familiar with are the drugs that we use to treat hepatitis C. So if we recall the drug Sovaldi for Hep C, that came out to market in 2013 at a price tag of $84,000 for a 12-week treatment duration. But it is, in general, it's thought to be curative. Okay. So we're going to take a little bit of a breather here and go through this exercise of how much does this drug cost. So the first drug we have here is Humira, the pen. And this is basically one of our monoclonal antibodies, a specialty drug used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, plaque psoriasis, and Crohn's disease. So obviously, this is going to be one of those expensive drugs. And if we take a look, we can see that, again, as I mentioned, which contract are we buying the Humira pen from? Is it the AWP, or average wholesale price, of over $6,000? Or the contracted price on our GPO at a little over $3,000? Or, as I mentioned, the cheapest price, which is our 340B, this is our government program, at 2 cents. And just so you know, the 340B program has a number of what they call penny buys. And this happens to be one of those penny buys that literally you can purchase the drug for 2 cents. And so you can clearly see from this that when we talk about drug pricing, and this is all for the same drug, right, it can be highly variable. Another example, and I mentioned this previously in my talk, the EpiPen. And remember, epinephrine has been a generic drug. It's been around for a long time. However, this is one of those where you had a lot of generic, what we call consolidation, and the EpiPen realistically is only available through, I believe, only one vendor that I'm aware of right now. And so they really have a monopoly on this market. And if we take a look at our drug prices for the EpiPen, we can see here as well. Oops, I don't know, let's go back. So if we look at the EpiPen, we can see that the pricing actually is variable as well, with the AWP, of course, being the highest, our contract price being a little over, or about $550. And then again, this is one of those penny buys on the 340B contract. So again, when we look at the pricing, it's highly variable, right, depending upon which contract that we're looking at. So finally, trying to come to some solutions here to address our drug spending. To summarize, the pharmaceutical costs in the US are really a factor of volume times mix times price. And so we can see from this slide that we have various drivers, right? The volumes we mentioned, increased aged population, there's a greater number of prescriptions being filled. In terms of mix, are we talking about generics or brand name products, biologics or biosimilars, which tend to be a little bit cheaper? We mentioned the specialty drug group being a very, very costly group of drugs. And then finally, genetic therapy, which is also very, very costly. Price, as we mentioned, there's sometimes a lack of competition with monopolies, market exclusions, consolidation, as we said, of various manufacturers, some anti-competitive behaviors, and certainly that lack of transparency, and also the lack of comparative efficacy of the drugs. So what are those solutions that we're looking at? And one, if we're looking at mix, I think we're all very familiar with generic substitution. So let's try to choose, right, the best drug for the cheapest price. We streamline our drug therapies. We attempt to develop various utilization management type initiatives. And then certainly what we're going to talk about, we're going to focus on today is really looking at value assessments. And this is where those outcomes-based contracts come in. In terms of price type solutions, this is where truthfully a lot of the public policy has been focused in terms of trying to mandate maybe certain transparency from our manufacturers to try and ban sort of monopolies, and to develop some rebate mandates based on volumes and that sort of thing. But we're going to focus today, as I mentioned, on some of the outcomes-based contract, or looking at the mix sort of area. So what is an outcomes-based contract? So with outcomes-based contracts, basically a pharmacy benefits management company on behalf of the health plan would negotiate with a manufacturer to set a rebate with measurable expected outcomes for a targeted population. So basically, with an outcomes-based contract, if a patient basically experiences any adverse symptoms, discontinues treatment, or something of that nature, then the manufacturer would actually issue a rebate back to the PBM for all or part of the drug cost. So an outcomes-based contract really ties payment to the achievement of measurable, very specific performance standards. It's obviously a very results-based type of an approach, and really focuses on quality and outcomes with the purpose of really increasing value. So really we're trying to direct our funds towards drug therapies that's very efficacious. It may be very expensive, however, the therapy itself may be very expensive, however, it may actually decrease total costs in the long run, and certainly would impact a patient's well-being or wellness. So the background for our outcomes-based contract is really, it's associated with the provisions outlined in the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015. It was considered to be an approach to decrease pharmaceutical expenses to providers and payers. And if we take a look, I wanted to share with you a few examples of outcomes-based contracts that demonstrate this. So with the first there being Entresto, which is one of our drugs for CHF. The manufacturer for this one is Novartis, and Novartis contracted with Aetna, one of our payers, to provide additional rebates if heart failure admission reductions were achieved in clinical trials. So basically, if a patient, I'm sorry, I apologize for the wording on here, it's a bit confusing, but basically in this situation, if this drug does not achieve the desired readmission reductions, then basically Novartis would pay Aetna a rebate. Repatha, which is a hypercholesterolemia drug, provided an upfront discount with additional rebates if the patient does not achieve the desired reductions in LDL, or would provide a full refund for the amount or the cost of the drug if the patient had a heart attack or a stroke. In return, Amgen, the manufacturer, got preferred formulary status on these payers' drug formularies. So you can begin to see here, these are two different contract examples, but you can begin to surmise for yourself, right, what are some of those benefits as well as some of the negative aspects of an outcomes-based contract. The third example here is for Januvia or Janumet, and these are both diabetes medications developed by Merck. And for this contract, Cigna would receive a rebate if the patient's if the desired hemoglobin A1C levels were not met. And also the agreement was contingent upon patients adhering to their medication therapy. So here we have value from the perspective of achieving a certain hemoglobin A1C but also the patient, basically must continue to take the medication, right? And so adherence was also figured into this particular contract. So with those examples, you can see that there are some benefits to these outcomes-based contracts. Number one, reduction in cost to health plans. I think as we see, the manufacturers actually have the benefit of gaining access to formularies where they might not have. They could also retain sales, right, for specific drugs. There is a bit of an increased transparency here with basically transparency with regard to actually achieving a certain efficacy and outcome for our patients. By certainly achieving access to drug formulary and potentially retaining or stimulating more sales of their drugs, manufacturers here are also incentivized to continue to innovate and to create some of these drugs, which might be very expensive. However, if they can gain that access, then there is certainly a population for whom it would be valuable and beneficial. Outcomes-based contracts also hold manufacturers accountable for drug performance and reward good patient outcomes. And some manufacturers have used this also as a very positive public relations tool for both, and it serves as a positive public relations tool for manufacturers as well as for the payer to say, hey, we're not just about generating revenue, but we're also very interested in outcomes. And you can hold us accountable to these outcomes because if our drug doesn't perform well, then we're willing to kind of put the money where our mouth is, and we're actually willing to pay some of the money back. Some of the disadvantages, as we can see from some of those examples to these outcomes-based contracts, is they are heavily reliant upon measurable items or claim submission data. And this doesn't include sort of those unmeasurables that are clearly at times just as important. For example, if we have an oncology drug, chemotherapy, certainly the number of tumor cells could be measured and may serve as one of those measurable items where we submit data, or we can certainly measure side effect profiles as well. Perhaps a person's white cell count would be a great example. Perhaps a new oncology agent doesn't impact a patient's white cell count as dramatically, and that is part of the claim or the advantage of a particular drug. However, at the same time, that same cancer patient, we're not looking at other quality of life factors. Is the patient able to kind of go about their day normally and do some of the normal things, get out of bed, and enjoy their life? These outcomes-based contracts certainly don't include some of those types of factors which are very important. Perhaps someone's mental health, that's not going to be included in some of these contracts either. And as we see, these contracts are really looking only at really easy to obtain results or changes in laboratory values. Another big factor, and I can speak from personal experience here, is inadequate analytical capabilities to support reporting. UCI Health, as we mentioned, we do have a specialty pharmacy here, and realistically, our information technology, in its kind of original form, was not capable of transmitting the type of data that was required to meet the expectations of these outcomes-based contracts. What this meant then is that there was a heavy amount of manual sort of data collection and data transmittal. And obviously, that's very costly. We are very, very fortunate here at UCI Health so that, we could afford to upgrade our systems. We could afford to put additional manpower in place so that we can collect and then transmit the required data. However, think about an independent retail pharmacy. They don't have, those type of resources to be able to do this, or a physician's, an independent physician's office, as an example, as well. It would be quite a struggle to be able to provide this type of data on a regular basis. However, that is the requirement of these contracts. Because of the complexity of the contracts, there's quite a lengthy negotiation process. So, both parties must agree on all of the various business values. And so, again, that's kind of a disadvantage. A lack of transparency. Realistically, these types of contracts are not available for viewing, right, for public viewing. So the reality is we don't really know as consumers and as the public, whether these contracts are in place or not. We wouldn't know either if any of the objectives are actually achieved. I think the other piece of this, and again, it's partly because of the expense and the complexity of the contracts, is there is a very limited scope of drugs to which these types of contracts may actually apply. And in fact, at the end of the day, these contracts may not actually lower the cost of pharmaceutical drug spending. Impact to patients, and I think that realistically, this is a very, very important part of our assessment of whether these outcomes-based contracts are indeed positive. These contracts actually have increased access to innovation for our patients. So, as I said, a lot of manufacturers are, perhaps incentivized to move forward with some of their new drug therapies that might be very, very costly, but might find a niche, in one of these OBC type contracts where where the manufacturer would actually be accountable to the outcomes. So there are more treatment options, I think, available to our patients because of these type of contracts. However, you must note that only patients who achieve a defined level of response are actually eligible for the reimbursements. And in fact, as I mentioned, if a patient doesn't achieve the desired outcome, then typically with these outcomes-based contracts, then the patient must actually terminate their drug therapy. And that can be, hugely negative to a patient because they might actually be achieving some amount of therapeutic response, but obviously, those numbers are kind of set numbers, and they aren't numbers that are, designed for each patient or unique to each patient. And so in that respect, although you can see on one hand, there could be increased access, there could also be decreased access. As I mentioned, I think that these types of contracts actually do promote innovation for our drug manufacturers. But then there is the potential issue related to protecting patient information. As I mentioned, these contracts require that outcomes data is transmitted to the manufacturer. We do get into a lot of, and this is where a lot of that sort of contract negotiation comes in, we do get into trying our very best to protect the patient's health information. So there could be certainly HIPAA concerns with regard to this. And finally, and I think this is one of the biggest kind of negative pieces of an OBC, which is, as you saw there, it doesn't actually lower the cost to patients. What it does is it provides rebates back to our third-party payers, right, as well as our PBMs. And so that's why I kind of, really wanted you to highlight, right, the middlemen in this whole supply chain. Also, these outcomes-based contracts obviously don't impact our patients' ability to obtain prescriptions that are very, very costly. So we know, right, that some of our patients, although a physician might prescribe the perfect drug therapy for them, but if the patient won't get it filled because it's just too costly, the out-of-pocket expenses are very high, then certainly these outcomes-based contracts don't have an impact there. So future directions. As we saw, the objective for our outcomes-based contract is really to align payment and value to real-world performance metrics. At present, what is known is there's about 25 outcomes-based contracts implemented in the United States. However, there may be many more than that. As I said, many are confidential, and that is a strategy that manufacturers use to gain formulary access. So again, not being very transparent. There's a lot of barriers and limitations to outcomes-based contracts. As I mentioned, the inability to obtain or transmit data, or those abilities might be readily available, but there are cost barriers, so that independent pharmacies or physicians may not be able to actually implement that technology that's needed to transmit the data. There's regulatory barriers that prevent manufacturers from disclosing some of the needed information. And I think the other big piece of this is that there's no gold standard methodology to an outcomes-based contract. So even with a few examples that I shared with you earlier, you saw how they were different from each other. You saw that there were some rebates that were given based on the patient's outcomes. However, some, or lack of outcomes, I guess I should say. However, others were written very differently, and they were looking more at upfront, sort of rebates. And so there's no methodology, there's no standard to this, so it's very hard to, I guess you could say, sort of control. I think, but on the other hand, at the end of the day, although an outcomes-based contract may not lower the overall drug spend, what they will do is steer our providers toward more effective drug therapy. And it does hold our manufacturers accountable to the promised outcomes. And I think that that is a hugely positive aspect of the outcomes-based contracts. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about some of the more recent drug cost policy proposals. And so in 2020, basically, President Trump executed executive orders. And as part of that, it included what was called the Most Favored Nation model. And this was basically a pilot program, or it was going to be a pilot program where that had to do basically with Medicare reimbursement. And in theory, this would lower the cost of medications by allowing Medicare to pay a similar amount for certain high-cost Medicare Part B drugs and biologics as the lowest price in a similar country. And I know that's very complicated, but at the end of the day, it was an attempt basically to align payment with international pricing. This pilot was slated to go live January 1st of this year, and it was going to extend through 2027. With it, it removed incentives to the provider to use higher cost drugs by decreasing the reimbursed amount. And so the reimbursement previously was the ASP, or average sales price, plus 6%. However, basically it decreased that reimbursement amount to no higher than the ASP. So it was kind of minus that 6% that providers and pharmacies were, I guess you could say, used to receiving. This particular model was going to impact about 50 drugs that are covered by Medicare Part B, and most of these drugs were those that were administered via injections or infusions in the ambulatory type setting. In addition to that, Trump's executive orders also included increased access to affordable life-saving medications. And this is in alignment with what Scott Thompson was just talking about in his discussion. And basically, this piece of the executive order allowed our federally qualified health centers, so the F2HCs, as we have at UCI in Santa Ana and Anaheim, to acquire insulin and EpiPens at a decreased price. And then it also increased drug importation as an attempt, again, to lower prices, and then lowered prices for patients by eliminating kickbacks to middlemen. Moving on, when President Biden took office, he basically put a freeze on the most favored nation model. However, he and his team are not necessarily opposed to that model. In fact, they actually support certain aspects of it. However, their definitions are not exactly the same. What President Biden has done is basically the most favored nation model has been put on pause until 2023, and then in the meantime, obviously, they will be looking at all aspects of drug pricing. Some of the other campaign platform ideals for the Biden-Harris administration were to repeal the exception that allows corporations to avoid negotiating prices with Medicare. So the way Medicare was written, it did not allow for negotiation of drug prices. And so there is the thought of terminating that, limiting drug prices on drugs that don't have any competition, allowing consumers to purchase drugs from other countries. So similar, again, to Trump in that, importation of drugs from other countries, eliminating tax breaks to pharmaceutical manufacturers for advertisement spending, and then finally, improving the supply of generic drugs by accelerating the development of generics. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I am open for any questions you might have.
I'm actually really glad that that closed with some of the more contemporary considerations in the drug pricing land and world, because it's actually a really hot topic right now around drug pricing and transparency. So thank you for that, Dr. Joe. I tried to provide some kind of foundational definitions as we were moving through the talk, but was there anything that people were left questioning or confused about or wanting to ask more questions about when it comes to this drug pricing discussion or conversation?
I was just going to say, actually, that I heard the tail end of Scott Thompson's discussion. And quite honestly, this talk actually is very much sort of in alignment with that, in that, a lot of because I sit on his committee as well, and so, but a lot of this outcomes-based contract is very similar, or contracting is very similar in that it's looking at quality. And basically not just paying for a product, right? I got a drug from you, I'm going to pay for it, but actually saying, hey, if this drug doesn't have the kind of quality that you are promising me, then you're going to pay me back some money, right, in the form of a rebate. And that's realistically the nature of the outcomes-based contract. And it's really about associating quality and outcomes with a certain drug.
And so I wonder, a question for you that I certainly have is in your slide where you talked about what it means for patients and the impact of outcomes-based, pricing models and on patients. If patients don't necessarily, and we as providers don't even necessarily understand what conversations have been had behind closed doors in order to arrive at a certain price for a drug, how do you think that we should best advise ourselves, our offices, and our patients on how to navigate um, the pharmaceutical landscape? Do we tell them to just take this good RX card and call it a day? Do we tell them to do research about what contracts might have been developed between um, their hospital or group or medical system and manufacturers? How do we do our own research to be better informed around those seemingly closed door conversations?
No, this is what you bring up is actually a really sort of challenging piece because you're absolutely right. Is there's so little transparency there. You're right. Most pharmacists, to tell you the truth, are not going to know anything about outcomes-based contracts. This is really I hate to say it, but very much on the high side of the administrative level, right? With regard to who even really knows about it and understands it, and then how does it really impact the patient? And I would venture to guess that for most patients, they know nothing, right, about an outcomes-based contract, and they don't realize that all of that sort of work is going on behind the scenes. But I think from the patient perspective, what we need to sort of advise them is that these very, very expensive drugs are what I personally see is that they are becoming much more specific. So meaning that, in the old days, you had a drug with a very general adult dose, right? And it was kind of almost like for all comers. Oh, this drug is for hypertension and it's for all comers. But nowadays, these drugs are getting down to the genotype, right? It's only for specific genotype patients. And with that, though, that type of technology is very, very expensive, but very directed as well. So meaning the patients that are going to get some of these specialty drugs where these outcomes-based contracts, right, actually come into play are likely to have really great outcomes because the drugs are so specific that, and they've been tested, right, on that population that, I think really what I'm looking at for a patient is, hey, I want you to be compliant. And when I'm asking you as a provider to, you need to get all of these labs and things, and many of those labs are certainly for my ability to see that, you're progressing or improving, as I would hope, right, on this drug therapy, but know that that same data is realistically going back to the manufacturer as part of this sort of outcomes-based contract. And it will actually, I think, ultimately stimulate more innovation and growth and those sort of things. So, as a provider to a patient, I'd say really important for you to be compliant, right? And we need to take all of these tests so I can see your improvement, hopefully, but also know that, it's moving forward towards, I guess I would say, reinforcing to the manufacturer that their drug is sort of acting the way it's supposed to. Right? That's kind of the way I see it, is it's really hard on from that patient's perspective because outcomes-based contracts realistically don't decrease the pricing to our patients. And I agree with what you said, Kelly. There's not a whole lot that you could tell your patients with some of these high-cost drugs other than, you got to look on GoodRx, right, and try to find the cheapest price. I know for us on the pharmacy side of things, we always call patients if a drug therapy is if the patient's out-of-pocket expense would exceed $50, right? We make those calls to patients and make sure that, are you aware, how expensive this is, and do you want us to fill it? I think, unfortunately, we as healthcare providers, right, may have to, if a patient is unable to fill it, then we have to look towards patient assistance programs to try and find other avenues to get the patients those drugs. And that's really our role. I know we do that in the pharmacy. I'm not sure if every pharmacy does, but UCI Pharmacy does. And, we really take the time to do that and to try and get authorizations. So approvals basically from a patient's insurer, right, to pay for some of those very, very expensive drugs. And that's kind of our sort of role. So I only ask that patients sort of be patient with us a little bit, right? Because all of that takes time and might take like a week, right, to get the approvals through the PBM so that a patient can actually get the drug. And then, like I say, that's really the pharmacy working in conjunction, in collaboration with the physician or the physician's office to ensure that we have all of the necessary data, right, so that we can get the patient access. So it's a very challenging, I think, situation for patients.
For all involved, really, for all involved. And I think it's working exactly as it was supposed to as a system, right? If it was supposed to be a fully transparent, low cost system, then it would be. I think the complexity is what maintains some of the status quo and some of what we saw as absolutely arbitrary and ridiculous price hikes. The Humira example is probably the most striking. The fact that there is a $6,000, $6,800,000, that's
yes,
$6,800 difference between, the price based on who the manufacturer, who the drug is coming from, it just really proves to us that this system was not designed to be transparent and low cost. And that
agreed.
Right.
Yeah. And so honestly, what you all probably hear in the news more nowadays is about the 340B program and various attempts to try to get our arms around that program. I think that, from a public, and I'm going to have to give my own little pitch here, I'll have to admit, but, I think the public program, and they see that, we can buy drugs at 2 cents, right, or 4 cents, and then we get reimbursed at the higher dollar amount. That is what these contract pharmacies, that's what you're achieving, right, with these 340B programs. But what you don't see, and that's some of kind of what probably Scott was alluding to, I would assume, in his talk, is that there are huge money losses, to tell you the truth, on a lot of your indigent population, right, that are absorbed by the system or by the hospital like UCI. And so although I might earn $2,000, just say, on one of those penny buy type prescriptions from the 340B program, we actually need that $2,000 really to offset the cost of some of our other programs that are not necessarily generating any revenue and in fact might be money losers. And so the public doesn't see that part, and I'm afraid to say it, neither do our policymakers, because they are not as intimately aware of what really happens here as you and I, as we are. I've done some lobbying, to be honest, in Washington, D.C. for the 340B program, and I can just clearly tell you that, in going around and speaking to our local senators and things of that nature, they're not familiar at all with what actually goes on for all of us as healthcare providers. And it really is up to us to make it known. And unfortunately, and not to put a big negative, but unfortunately, pharma and the manufacturers have paid people who are constantly knocking on their doors as lobbyists, like daily, and we can only go up there once a year or whatever it is, right, to sort of state our case. So we really need to sort of educate our patients also as best we can, because they do ultimately have a voice, and they can ultimately make it known, like, hey, no, we actually need to support that, because but I don't think that the general person out there realizes that there are losses that are just kind of behind the scenes, and that you do need to generate some of this revenue, quote unquote, right, to offset that. And so although, so that's why you need those kinds of programs, because the expenses can be very, very high.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is the information we need to be effective advocates. I think that's actually a really great place for us to stop today, Dr. Joe. Just the call for all of us to be more informed in order to bring that lived experience, knowledge, and background to the policymaking discussion. So we thank you for being with us today, Dr. Joe, especially as a two-time speaker for us during the Advanced Health Policy Elective. We appreciate you.
Oh, it's my pleasure.